Good morning. I want to invite your attention to Luke chapter 22, if you'll be opening there, please. Luke chapter 22 is where we're going to start this morning. I want to read just the opening verses of this context. Now the feast of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put Jesus to death, for they were afraid of the people. And Satan entered into Judas, who is called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12, and he went away and discussed with the chief priests and the officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. And he consented and began seeking a good opportunity to betray him to them apart from the multitude. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And so Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it." And they said to him, "Where do you want us to prepare it?" And he said to them, "Behold, when you've entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters. And you shall say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large furnished upper room. Prepare it there." And they departed and found everything just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. Jesus gave to Peter and John the task of preparing this Passover, the last Passover that he would celebrate with the 12. His directions here are purposely cryptic. He doesn't tell them exactly where to go. He tells them to go into the city and that they're going to see this man and he's carrying a pitcher and they're to follow him wherever he goes. And he's going to go into a house and you go into the house. And then these are the words that you're supposed to say. And so there's all this kind of charade that he tells them to go through that's a bit cryptic. All the other disciples, including Judas, which is key here, are prevented from knowing where Jesus and the disciples will be on Passover Eve. We know, because Luke has just told us, that Judas is looking for some opportune time to betray him. This would be one of those when he would be alone with the 12 and away from the multitude. And so the crypticness of his instructions, what that does is delay Jesus' arrest until he is fully prepared his disciples and all the necessary inertia is in place so that everything unfolds on this eve just as exactly as God planned. Who the owner of the house is, how Jesus made arrangements with him, all of that's a mystery. Luke doesn't tell us that. None of the gospel writers do. We can guess about that, but it would just be a guess. The fact is that we don't know. But could I say to you that there is a lesson in that mystery? A lesson that Peter and John discovered, and one that we need to discover too. What they learned upon their arrival to that place, to that house, is that the Lord's hand had been there ahead of them. Do you see that? And I wanted to build on this theme that we introduced last week, that when we have God's heart, we find His hand, so that we as a people, we as individuals, and we as a congregation practice living expectantly. That we move forward, not in the coming year, and move forward in our lives, and move forward in our walk of faith, with expectation that God is going to be there ahead of us. Now, I painted for you in the teaser for this lesson the fact that there are three scenarios that we can find ourselves in. We can be a people that live like the disciples did in the city of Antioch with great expectation that when we are about God's purposes, then we partner with God in what His purposes are, and that He is going to be there. But we can also find ourselves fighting against the hand of God, like Saul of Tarsus did, or like the Pharaoh of Egypt did in the days of Moses. And we're going to find God's hand too, the same way that Saul did, and the same way that the same way that the Pharaoh did, but we're going to find ourselves on the opposing end of God's hand. And what we'll find when we oppose God's hand is that God still uses us for His purposes, even without our knowing it, or even without our intending it. But God's hand still is mighty and will still use us to accomplish what He wants. The situation that I'm the most fearful of is the one that's in between my finding the hand of God and my fighting the hand of God. And that's living a life where I'm just oblivious to the work that God is doing every day. And the purpose for coming to this context this morning is that I think that Jesus was doing some things in these final hours with the disciples, and not just here, He does it on lots of different occasions, where He is really teaching the 12 as He's getting ready to be crucified and to be risen again and to ascend to heaven and to send them out as witnesses. They really need to be men who live expectantly, who know that God is going to be there, and who have absolute confidence in His power and in His rule. Not only so that they have that themselves, but so that they can communicate that to the communities of faith, to the believers that they're going to establish in churches all over the world. And it's an expectancy that we need to have too. And so it's the reason why I bring us to this text. What do we find the hand of God doing in our life? I want to suggest to you that we find God's hand doing the same kind of things that are described here in Luke chapter 22. Here's number one. You know what God's hand is doing ahead of us? The hand of God is making the way easier for His servants. The hand of God is making the way easier for His servants. That's exactly what Peter and John find when they come to the upper room. Jesus had sent them on a service mission. They were to go and they were to get things ready for the Passover. And when Peter and John get there, they find that the Lord has already made it easy for them. He's already taken care of the room arrangements. He's already taken care of where it's going to be and all the furnishings there. Everything is set and everything's prepared. Look at what it says in verse 13. They departed and found everything just as He had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And so everything is prepared because God had already prepared the way for them to make their way easier as servants. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that when I am about service, then I'm going to find the same thing to be true. And it's the reason why I can surrender myself to being a servant, not only to God, but to the people that God puts around me. It's the reason why we can live a good Samaritan kind of life. It's the reason why we can be a people that are on a journey and then find somebody that's in need and recognize that God is calling us to be a neighbor to someone who's a complete stranger, or a neighbor to someone who's an enemy, like the Jew would have been to the Samaritan, or to be a neighbor to someone that has crossed our path, and to see that the opportunity that is there is something that God has put in our path, that He's put in our way, so that we can minister the grace of God to that person that He has made our neighbor today. Now, I believe that God makes the way easy for His servants when we are a people that are surrendered to service. And knowing that God's hand is ahead of me in that gives me great boldness about being a servant, because He's going to be there. And He's going to furnish things, and He's going to take care of things, so that the path of being a servant is an easier way to go. That's a reason to hasten to serve. It's a reason to whistle while I work when I serve, because I know that when I'm doing that, I'm partnering with God in the doing of that. Look, if you would, at verse 21 of the text, and we find something else that God's hand is doing ahead of us. I said to you that His hand is ahead of us when we have His heart and when we're finding Him, but it's also ahead of us in another circumstance. In verse 21, as they're at the table eating the supper, Jesus says the following, "Behold, the hand of the one who is betraying me is on the table. For indeed the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom He is betrayed." And they began to discuss among themselves which one of them it might be who is going to do this thing. The Lord didn't owe Judas anything. The Lord was not obliged to confront Him. But I am so moved by the fact that here on this last eve, in this Last Supper, Jesus makes one more attempt to confront Him. He gives him an out. He doesn't call out His name. But can you imagine sitting at the table and hearing those words and knowing what you have concocted, what you've conceived in your mind, and the money that you've got in your pocket, and not have some pricking of conscience in that conversation? And isn't that the Lord's intent? And so the 12 or the other 11 are going to know after this event. Jesus knew what was going on all the while in the mind of Judas. But He wants Judas to know that right now. And there's a message for me in where God's hand is in my life. God's hand is delaying the folly of the betrayer. Now that's a comfort to me. That when I am headed down a path that's not a good path, and I have found this to be the case, and maybe you found this to be the case too, that God puts these signposts up along the way. Caution, no more exits. 1 mile, bridges out, something. But I find in my life that God puts these signposts. Sometimes they're people, sometimes they're situations, sometimes they're reminders that look like they are totally random. Like, why did we decide to study that passage today? Or why is it that somebody said that to me? It's as if God is there, giving us one more opportunity to make a change. It's a comfort to me that His hand is ahead of the betrayer, and that He's warning me about the path that I'm on when it's not a good one, and that He would do that for Judas. And if He would do that for him, He would do that for us. So His hand is delaying the folly of the betrayer. Now that is not reason for me to take comfort that to run down a bad path, because He will not delay the folly of the betrayer forever. There's a time where he has to finally let Judas go. He's not going to jump in front of him. But He sure tries to warn him so that he would turn quickly from his hypocrisy. And He does that for us. Something else that we find God's hand doing, look if you would at verse 53 of this same context. I wish we could read the whole chapter, but there's just not time this morning. In verse 53 it says, Jesus, when He is in the garden and when the soldiers come to arrest Him, look at what He says to them. Actually, the end of verse 52 is where His words begin. He says, have you come out with swords and clubs as against a robber? You guys know who I am. I've been in the temple every day, and you come out as if I'm some kind of thug. As if have I ever hurt any of you all? And so you come out here with clubs and with spears as if I'm a robber of some sort. And He says, while I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. Now notice what He says, but this hour and the power of darkness are yours. Jesus says to these soldiers, and He's communicating to the Sanhedrin that has sent them, and to all the things that are going to take place over the course of this night as He's rushed through these trials with the Jews and these trials before the Romans, He's letting them know that His hand's been here ahead of this. He says, the only reason why you're taking me right now, as our brother said so well at the table, is because you've been given permission to do so. This hour and this power of darkness are yours. Not for the taking, but because God has given it to you. But it's just an hour. And you need to know that this is not the way it's going to be. And so for a little time, it's going to look like darkness is going to win. But darkness is not going to win. For a little while, it's going to look like Satan has the upper hand, but Satan is not going to have the upper hand. For a little while, it looks as if man's going to get his way, but man is not going to get his way. God is ruling. God is going to get His way, and His purposes are going to prevail. And the thing that we need to know about the hand of God that needs to make us an expectant people, is that His hand is always stealing the victory away from the rebellious. Satan and the forces that he marshals, and man and the kingdoms of men and the forces that man marshals, they are not going to win. The victory is with God. And we can have absolute confidence in that. And so one of the ways that I need to know that God's hand is ahead of me is that He is going to steal the victory away from the rebellious, so that there is, as our brother prayed so well, there is no need for us to fear. God is there. His hand is doing something else that Peter learns in this context. In verse 31, Jesus has something to say to everyone. And so He says this to Peter: "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I've prayed for you, that your faith may not fail you, that your faith may not fail, and you, when once you've turned again, strengthen your brothers." Peter, of course, sticks out his chest, says, "Lord, I'm ready to die for you right now, tonight. I'm ready to go to prison and to death." And he says, "Peter, I say to you, the cock will not crow today until you've denied me 3 times, or denied 3 times that you know me. Before the sun comes up, your faith is going to fail. But I have prayed that it be not fatal for you." What do I learn in that? Well, I learn from that even when Satan sifts me, that God's hand is still there. And that what His hand is doing for me is the same thing that His hand is doing for Peter. And that is that God's hand is turning Satan's sifting into God's refining. Satan means this for Peter's destruction, but not God. He's going to take this as an opportunity to teach Peter a lesson, to grow Peter's faith, to reform Peter's character, to teach him a little bit about his proud way and his self-confidence. There's some ways in which this personality trait of Peter, this kind of rush ahead, this kind of jump in with both feet, this kind of run into whatever that's coming. There's a way that needs to be channeled so that it's not a self-confidence on the part of Peter, but so that it's a God confidence, and he needs more humility in that. And so God is going to teach him something about that in this occasion. He's going to teach him something about how the greatness is going to be measured by him being someone who's willing to suffer, not someone who just is ready to win with God. And so Peter's going to have to learn an important lesson here. Satan, for a little while, would have Peter in his hands, but unlike Judas, he was not in his heart. Not in Peter's heart, that is. And so God was going to take this purpose of Satan and He was going to turn it into something that would better Peter. I am so grateful for the grace of God that doesn't give up on us when Satan sifts. And he will sift you. Be sure of that. There's too many people for him not to be sifting someone here right now. And if that's where you are, I want you to trust God's hand in that. That if something's got you down, that if Satan's beating you up, that you don't give up on God in that. And may his prayer for Peter be his appeal for you as he intercedes as our high priest. That your faith be strengthened. And that he take this sifting and turn it into something that refines your character and makes you even more useful to God than what you've been. His hand is ahead of us in that. His hand is doing something else that we read about here for Peter. Look, if you would, at verse 49 of the text. When Peter shows that he's going to make good on the promise that he made to Jesus earlier that night. In verse 49, when Judas comes and when he betrays who Jesus is, his identity with a kiss in the shadows of the night as they're there in Gethsemane, the guards want to know for sure who they're going to arrest. Judas kisses Jesus. That's the agreement that they've made. And in verse 49 it says, "And when those who were around Jesus saw what was going to happen, they said, 'Lord, shall we strike with the sword?' And a certain one of them," we know from elsewhere that it's Peter, "a certain one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, 'Stop, no more of this.' And he touched his ear and he healed them." I'm sure Peter was saying, "What is this?" I mean, he's ready to die. He's ready to fight. He's ready to go to jail. But what is this? What are you doing, Lord? And what Peter doesn't understand is that the hand of the Lord is ahead of him again, and this time saving him from his own recklessness. God be thanked for that. I don't know how much dumb stuff that I've done in my life where if God had just let me go my way, it would have been all over. And yet, here, in Peter's case, God rescues him from his folly. Now, in Peter's case here, it's a well-motivated folly. He thinks he's doing the right thing. He is all about God, but he's being reckless here, rather than letting Jesus take the lead. And God be thanked that He's ahead of us in our recklessness. When we're totally convinced that what we're about is the right thing and the right way and it's the right time. And now that again is not permission for me just to put everything on cruise control and say, "Okay, you take the wheel, Lord." Nor is it permission for me to run ahead and expect that He's always going to build a guardrail, or that He's always going to put me in a seatbelt or a harness or a parachute or something that's going to rescue me. But it is reason for me to take great gratitude when I look back on my life and I see what He's done, so that I have a bigger faith that His hand is there ahead of me. One more thing that I want you to see about His hand comes from what He says in verse 19, when they're sitting together at the supper. And Jesus, when He'd taken some bread and given thanks, He broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way He took the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." The disciples did not understand what He was saying there. The bread, how is it His body? And the cup, how is it His blood? They would understand it later on. But you see the point again, that He's wanting them to look back on these events, and He's wanting them to see that His hand was ahead of all of this. I wish that I could explain the tragedies that go on in the world, like up in Connecticut. There's a certain sense in which we in our country are a bit protected, because there are parts of the world where that kind of stuff goes on every day, multiple times a day. And there's some sense in which we as a people are a bit isolated, insulated from some of the chaos and hurt that's just a part of this sin-cursed world. And I don't get all of that. I can't. I don't want to explain it. I want to take it away. But I know that on a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And it was on that old cross that the dearest and blessed for a world of lost sinners was slain. There is no way that you can make sense of what happened at Calvary. There is no way that you can logically say that this was something that ought to be done. That the innocent should die. That God's Son should be crucified. And these 12 are about, in a short time, to see the most senseless, the most tragic, and they'd known tragedy, that they'd known hurt, they'd known things that weren't fair, things that weren't just. But they were about to witness the most senseless, the most tragic, the most unthinkable event that they'd ever witnessed in their life. But before all of that senselessness occurred, Jesus is already making sense of it. He's already saying, this is what it's about and this is what it means. And so this thing that doesn't make any sense to you, this is about redemption. This is about God's work. And the body that you're going to see broken and the blood that you're going to see shed, this is not senseless at all. In fact, there's great purpose in this. The purpose is in this. And so the hand of God is ahead of things that are senseless, of things that are tragic, already making sense of it, already giving purpose to it, to take away our fear of death and to see that there is more to this life than just this mortal existence, that God has something better prepared. And so, when I think about senseless things, and we all live in some of that world, there can be some confidence with knowing that His hand is ahead of us. And we may not get it now. We may not understand it now. But somehow, some way, He can make a purpose out of the pain that's in my life. Somehow, some way, He can take it and He can make it something that's going to change me, that's going to better me, or maybe better someone else. So His hand is ahead, making the sense of the awful, the painful, the senseless. Could I say to you that God's hand is putting all of our hands to His purposes? Doesn't matter who we're talking about in this story here, the hands of the chief priests and the scribes, the hands of Judas, the hands that prepared the Passover, the hands that carried the water pitcher, the hands that shared the cup and the loaf at the table, the hands that said, I'm the greatest in the kingdom when they sat at the table, the hands that folded when they got into the garden and instead of praying were sleeping, the hands that carried the clubs and the spears to arrest the Savior, the hands that wielded the sword to defend the Master, the hands that warmed themselves by the fire when Peter would say, I don't know him, the hands that pointed and said, this man was with him too, the hands that blindfolded and slapped and beat and bruised the Lamb of God. Everybody's just doing their own thing. They're just doing what they want to do. But all of them, every pair of hands in the whole story, we're not doing anything apart from the purpose of God. His hand controls it all. And I can either partner with Him in His purposes, or I can oppose Him in His purposes, or I can be oblivious to His purposes, but His purposes are moving ahead and His hand is carrying them there. And that is reason for us as His people to live expectantly when we are about God's purposes. We are either a willing or we are an unwilling participant in His purposes, but we are a participant. So we can have confidence in the hand of God and live an expectant life when we are about the things of God, because His hand is preparing a way for the servant. It's giving good reason for sincerity and no reason for rebellion. His hand is with us in our sifting. It's beckoning us not to be rash or hasty. It's making sense of the senseless. It's putting our hands to His purposes, whether we intend for Him to do so or not. Why would you not serve this King? Why would you not make this Jesus your Lord? Why would you not have the confidence of knowing that your fortune and your future and your well-being is entrusted to His hand? Why would you not make Him your Savior? And why would you not make Him your Lord even this hour?